The Mercer plantation sat on 3,000 acres of Georgia lowland, a place where the red clay seemed to hold secrets the way soil holds moisture. On the morning of October 14, 1847, a neighbor's boy rode up to the main house to deliver a message about the county fair and found something that would haunt the region for generations. The dining room table was still set. The food had turned cold, the candles had burned down to stubs, and the chairs sat empty. But the family was gone, vanished. Not a trace of struggle, not a note, not a single explanation. Just an abandoned meal and a mystery that would spawn 100 theories. None of them quite believable, and all of them somehow worse than the last. Before we continue with the story of the Mercer family and the night they disappeared from their own home, if you're listening from somewhere in the South, or if you've ever wondered about the families who vanished without a trace in American history, let me know where you're tuning in from. Drop your state in the comments. I want to know if this story reaches people who live near the very places where these mysteries unfolded. And if you're already feeling the chill of this mystery, hit that subscribe button now, because we're about to uncover what really happened inside that plantation house. The Mercer family wasn't particularly notable in the annals of Georgia planter society. Thomas Mercer had inherited the plantation from his father, along with the considerable debts that came with it. He was a man of 43 years, with the kind of face that suggested he'd spent his life calculating numbers. His eyes were sharp, always moving, always assessing. His wife, Eleanor, was 10 years his junior, a woman from a Charleston merchant family who'd married down in status but up in land. She had the kind of beauty that came from careful maintenance. Her dark hair was always pinned precisely, her dresses were always the finest available, and her smile never quite reached her eyes. They had 3 children. Catherine, their eldest daughter, was 19 and had been promised to a neighboring planter's son. A match that would have consolidated 2 significant properties. She was quiet, the kind of girl who seemed to observe more than she participated, and she had her mother's careful beauty but her father's calculating gaze. Then there was William, 17, who was supposed to inherit the plantation and had been groomed for that role since birth. He was handsome in the way young men often are, with an easy confidence that suggested he'd never doubted his place in the world. The youngest was Margaret, just 14, still caught between childhood and whatever came next. She was the only one of the 3 who seemed to genuinely laugh. The plantation itself was a sprawling affair. The main house was built in the federal style, with white columns and a wraparound porch that caught the afternoon light. It had been expanded twice since its original construction in 1789, and the additions gave it an asymmetrical quality, as if the building itself couldn't quite decide what it wanted to be. The grounds were meticulously maintained. The lawn was cut short, the gardens were pruned, the outbuildings were whitewashed and orderly. Everything about the Mercer plantation suggested control, precision, and wealth carefully managed. But control, as anyone who has lived in the South knows, is always an illusion. The household staff consisted of approximately 40 enslaved people, though the exact number fluctuated. There was a head housekeeper named Ruth, who had been with the family for 23 years, and who ran the domestic operations with an iron will that rivaled Eleanor's. There was a cook named Samuel, who had trained in Charleston, and who took pride in his work. The meals that came from his kitchen were considered among the finest in the county. There were field hands, stable workers, a blacksmith, a carpenter, and various others whose names and faces were known only to those who lived and worked among them. The night of October 13, 1847, was unremarkable in almost every way. The weather was mild for October, warm enough that the evening air felt almost summery, though there was a dampness to it that suggested rain was coming. The family had gathered for dinner at 7 o'clock, as they always did. Samuel had prepared a meal of roasted chicken, fresh vegetables from the garden, bread that had been baked that morning, and a custard for dessert. The dining room was lit by candles. Gas lighting hadn't yet reached this part of Georgia, and the table was set with the family's good china, the pieces that were reserved for occasions when they wanted to impress. But there was no guest that evening. No visiting relative, no neighbor stopping by, no occasion that warranted the use of the good china. Eleanor had simply decided, according to the testimony of Ruth, who had helped prepare the table, that they would dine formally. It was a Tuesday. Nothing about it suggested it would be anything other than an ordinary evening. The family sat down to eat at 7 o'clock. Ruth served the meal, and then withdrew to the kitchen as was customary. Samuel was there, along with 2 younger servants who helped with the washing and clearing. The dining room door was closed as it always was during meals. The family preferred privacy while they ate, and the servants knew better than to interrupt unless called upon. At 8:30, Ruth went to clear the first course. She knocked on the dining room door, as was proper, and received no answer. She knocked again, louder this time. Still nothing. She opened the door slowly, expecting to find them still eating, perhaps engaged in conversation, perhaps having lost track of time. What she found instead was a tableau that would be described, in various accounts, as unnatural, impossible, and as if they had simply ceased to exist. The table was exactly as it had been left. The first course had been cleared. The plates that had held the soup were gone, which meant the family had eaten at least that much. The main course was still there, however. The chicken had cooled to room temperature. The vegetables had begun to wilt. The bread had hardened. The candles had burned down significantly, suggesting that considerable time had passed. But the chairs were empty. All 4 of them, Thomas, Eleanor, Catherine, and William. Margaret's chair was also empty, though her plate had barely been touched. The room was undisturbed. The windows were closed and latched from the inside. The door through which Ruth had just entered was the only exit, and no one had passed through it. The candlestick still stood upright. The tablecloth bore no signs of struggle or disturbance. It was as if the family had simply stood up and walked away, leaving everything exactly as it was. Ruth's scream brought Samuel running. He found her standing in the doorway, her hand over her mouth, her face the color of old parchment. The other servants came behind him, and within minutes, the entire household knew that something inexplicable had occurred. The search began immediately. The house was thoroughly examined, every room, every closet, every space large enough to hide a person. The grounds were searched with torches and lanterns as darkness fell. The nearby woods were combed. The river that ran along the eastern edge of the property was checked, though no bodies were found. By midnight, neighbors had been summoned, and by dawn, a search party of nearly 50 men was scouring the countryside for any sign of the missing family. They found nothing. The county sheriff arrived on the morning of October 15th. His name was James Harrow, and he was a man who had held his position for 12 years without ever encountering anything that truly puzzled him. Most crimes in the county were straightforward: a stolen horse, a fight between drunk men, occasionally a theft. He was accustomed to simple explanations and simple solutions. The Mercer disappearance was neither. Harrow was a methodical man. He interviewed Ruth first in the kitchen, with Samuel present. Ruth's account was consistent and detailed. She described the family sitting down to dinner, the meal being served, the door being closed. She described the sounds from the dining room, the clink of silverware, the murmur of conversation, nothing unusual. She described the silence that had fallen around 8 o'clock, which she had assumed meant they were finishing their meal. She described opening the door and finding the room empty. "Did you see them leave?" Harrow asked. "No, sir, I did not." "Could they have left through the windows?" "The windows were latched from the inside, sir. I checked myself." "Could they have gone through the kitchen?" "No, sir. I was in the kitchen the entire time. No one came through." Harrow interviewed the other servants. Their accounts were consistent with Ruth's. No one had seen the family leave the dining room. No one had heard any sounds of distress or struggle. It was as if they had simply vanished. Harrow then examined the dining room himself. He was looking for signs of foul play, for evidence of a struggle, for anything that might suggest what had happened. He found nothing. The room was orderly. The table was set. The food was there. The candles had burned down, suggesting that the family had been in the room for some time after sitting down. but there was no explanation for their absence. He interviewed the neighbors who had been present during the initial search. They confirmed that the house had been thoroughly examined, that no bodies had been found, that there were no signs of the family anywhere on the grounds. One neighbor, a man named Garrett, mentioned that he had noticed something odd. The horses in the stable were still there, all of them. If the family had fled, they would have taken horses, but the horses remained undisturbed in their stalls. This detail troubled Harrow. It suggested that the family had not fled voluntarily. But if they hadn't fled, where were they? Over the following days, Harrow interviewed everyone connected to the household. He spoke with the enslaved people who worked on the plantation, though his interviews with them were cursory. He seemed to assume that they would have no useful information, or that if they did, they would be unlikely to share it with a white lawman. He spoke with neighbors and distant relatives. He spoke with the man to whom Catherine had been promised, a planter named Hutchins, who lived 5 miles away. Hutchins seemed genuinely shocked by the news and expressed concern for Catherine's welfare, though there was something in his tone that suggested his concern was primarily financial. The marriage would have brought him significant property. A week after the disappearance, Harrow made a public announcement. He stated that the Mercer family had vanished under mysterious circumstances, that foul play could not be ruled out, and that anyone with information should come forward. He offered a reward of $50 for information leading to the discovery of the family's whereabouts. In 1847, $50 was a substantial sum, enough to feed a family for several months. No one came forward. The weeks turned into months. The search was gradually called off. The reward was never claimed. The Mercer plantation fell into a kind of limbo. The enslaved people who worked there were technically still the property of Thomas Mercer, but with no master to direct them, they were in an uncertain position. Some remained on the plantation, continuing their work out of habit or fear of what might happen if they left. Others drifted away, disappearing into the countryside or making their way to larger towns where they might find work or anonymity. The house itself began to fall into disrepair. Without Eleanor's careful management and the servants' daily attention, the gardens grew wild. The paint on the columns began to peel, the wraparound porch developed rot. The interior, which had been so meticulously maintained, began to show signs of neglect. Dust accumulated on the furniture. The curtains faded in the sunlight. The dining room, where the family had vanished, became a place that people avoided. The table was left exactly as it had been found, as if removing it might somehow erase the last evidence of what had happened. By the end of 1847, the Mercer disappearance had become a local legend. People told stories about what had happened that night. Some said the family had been taken by spirits, a punishment for some sin they had committed. Others suggested that they had been kidnapped by abolitionists, spirited away to the north. Still others whispered about curses, about the land itself rejecting those who worked it, about debts paid in blood rather than money. But the truth, as is often the case, was far more complicated and far more human. To understand what happened to the Mercer family, one must first understand the nature of the household they inhabited. On the surface, it was a place of order and control. But beneath that surface, like rot hidden beneath polished wood, there were fractures that had been widening for years. Thomas Mercer's financial situation was far more precarious than most people realized. The plantation was profitable, yes, but not profitable enough to support the lifestyle that Eleanor demanded. She came from a merchant family, people accustomed to wealth and luxury, and she had no intention of living as a mere planter's wife. She wanted the finest things, the best clothes, the most impressive entertainments. Thomas had indulged her, and in doing so, he had accumulated debts that were becoming increasingly difficult to manage. By 1847, Thomas owed money to 3 different creditors in Savannah. He owed money to a banker in Charleston. He owed money to a merchant in Atlanta. The debts were substantial, and the creditors were becoming impatient. Letters had begun to arrive, letters that grew increasingly threatening in tone. There was talk of foreclosure, of the plantation being seized to pay what was owed. Thomas had begun to drink more heavily, a fact that was noted by those who saw him in town. He had become withdrawn, irritable, prone to sudden rages followed by periods of deep melancholy. Eleanor, for her part, seemed oblivious to the financial crisis. Or perhaps she was not oblivious, perhaps she simply refused to acknowledge it. She continued to order expensive fabrics from Charleston. She continued to plan elaborate entertainments. She continued to live as if the money would never run out, as if the debts were merely a temporary inconvenience that Thomas would somehow resolve. Catherine, the eldest daughter, was aware of the situation. She was intelligent and observant, and she had overheard conversations between her parents that made the true state of affairs clear. She understood that her marriage to Hutchins was not a love match, but a financial transaction, a way of consolidating properties and securing the family's future. She had accepted this, as young women of her class were expected to accept such things, but she had also begun to understand that her future was not as secure as she had once believed. William, the heir, was less aware of the crisis, or perhaps he simply chose not to think about it. He was 17, confident in his position, convinced that he would inherit the plantation and that everything would be fine. He had no real understanding of the debts, no comprehension of what it meant to be responsible for such a large enterprise. He spent his time riding, hunting, and socializing with other young men of his class. He had a girlfriend, a girl from a neighboring plantation, and he was already making plans for his future, plans that assumed the plantation would be there, stable and profitable, waiting for him to take over. Margaret, the youngest, was largely unaware of the crisis. At 14, she was still caught in the world of childhood, still believing that her parents were all-powerful, that they could solve any problem, that the world would always be as it was. But there was another element to the household that no one outside of it fully understood. There was a secret that had been kept for years, a secret that had the potential to destroy everything: the family's reputation, their social standing, their very place in society. Ruth, the head housekeeper, knew this secret. She had known it for years, and she had kept it because she had no choice, because the alternative would have been unthinkable. Samuel, the cook, also knew, though he knew it in a different way, through fragments of overheard conversations and the careful observation of someone who lived on the margins of the household. The secret involved Catherine. Catherine had become pregnant in the spring of 1847. The father was not the man to whom she had been promised. The father was a young man named Henry Garrett, the son of the neighbor who had mentioned the horses to Sheriff Harrow. Henry was handsome, charming, and completely unsuitable. He had no money, no prospects, and no social standing. He was the kind of young man that Eleanor would have dismissed out of hand, the kind of man that Thomas would have forbidden his daughter to see. But Catherine had seen him anyway. She had met him in secret, in the woods near the river, in the stable late at night, in the garden when she was supposed to be taking her constitutional. It had been a brief affair, conducted with the kind of desperate passion that only young people can manage. When Catherine realized she was pregnant, she had been terrified. She had confided in Ruth, who had been the only person she could trust. Ruth had helped her. She had obtained herbs from an old woman who lived in the quarters, a woman who knew things about the body that most people preferred not to acknowledge. The herbs had worked, though not without cost. Catherine had been ill for days, fevered and weak, and there had been moments when Ruth had feared for her life. But the pregnancy had ended, and Catherine had recovered, and the secret had been kept. But secrets, like debts, accumulate interest. They grow heavier with time. They begin to poison everything they touch. Eleanor had begun to suspect something. She had noticed Catherine's illness, had seen the way Ruth had hovered over her, had observed the careful way that Catherine moved for weeks afterward. Eleanor was not a stupid woman. She was, in fact, quite intelligent, and her intelligence was turned toward the detection of threats to her family's standing. She had begun to ask questions, carefully, obliquely, in the way that women of her class had learned to ask questions without directly accusing anyone of anything. Catherine had denied everything, of course, but Eleanor had not believed her. Eleanor had begun to watch Catherine more carefully, to restrict her movements, to question her about where she had been and whom she had seen. The relationship between mother and daughter, which had always been somewhat distant, had become actively hostile. Thomas, meanwhile, was consumed by his financial worries. He barely noticed the tension between his wife and daughter. He spent his days managing the plantation, his evenings drinking, his nights lying awake and calculating figures that never quite added up. He was a man being slowly crushed by the weight of his own failures, and he had begun to contemplate solutions that were increasingly desperate. William was aware that something was wrong, but he was too self-absorbed to pay much attention. He was in love, or thought he was, and he was making plans for his future that did not include his family's financial crisis. He assumed that his father would solve the problem, as fathers were supposed to do. He assumed that his inheritance would be waiting for him when he came of age. He assumed that the world would continue to operate according to the rules he had been taught. Margaret noticed nothing. She was 14, and the world of adults was still largely opaque to her. She loved her family, and she assumed that they loved each other, and she had no idea that beneath the surface of their orderly household, things were beginning to crack. On the evening of October 13th, 1847, all of these tensions, all of these secrets, all of these desperate calculations came to a head. The meal began normally enough. Samuel had prepared the food, Ruth had served it, and the family had begun to eat. But as the evening progressed, the conversation took a turn that would have seemed innocuous to an outside observer, but that carried, for those involved, the weight of everything that had been left unsaid for months. Thomas had received a letter that day. It was from the banker in Charleston, and it was final. The debts had to be paid within 30 days, or the plantation would be seized. Thomas had read the letter multiple times, and by the time he sat down to dinner, he had consumed nearly half a bottle of whiskey. His hands shook slightly as he held his fork. His eyes had a glassy quality that suggested he was not entirely present. Eleanor noticed immediately. She always noticed when Thomas drank, and she always responded with a kind of cold disapproval that made the situation worse rather than better. She made a comment about the quality of the wine, a subtle criticism that was really a criticism of Thomas's state. Thomas responded with irritation. Eleanor pressed further. Within minutes, they were engaged in the kind of argument that had become increasingly common in the household, an argument that was ostensibly about one thing, but was really about everything. "You have failed," Eleanor said, her voice low but sharp. "You have failed as a provider, as a manager, as a man. My father would never have allowed himself to be in such a position." Thomas's face flushed. "Your father was a merchant, Eleanor. A merchant trades in goods, not in land. It is not the same thing." "No," Eleanor agreed. "It is not the same thing. My father succeeded. You have not." Catherine, who had been eating quietly, suddenly spoke. "Perhaps if you had not insisted on such extravagance, Mother, Father would not be in this position." The table went silent. Eleanor turned to look at her daughter, and her expression was one of pure shock. Catherine had never directly contradicted her before. Catherine had never spoken to her in such a tone. "What did you say?" Eleanor's voice was dangerous, quiet in the way that a knife is quiet before it cuts. "I said that perhaps if you had not insisted on such extravagance." "I heard what you said. I am asking you what you meant by it." Catherine's hands were shaking, but she continued. "I meant that you spend money as if it grows on trees, the dresses, the entertainments, the furnishings. You spend without thinking about where the money comes from." Eleanor stood up from the table. "You will not speak to me in that manner. You will apologize immediately." "I will not," Catherine said. And then, as if the words had been dammed up inside her for months and had finally broken through, she continued, "I will not apologize because it is the truth. You have spent this family into ruin, and you refuse to acknowledge it. You refuse to acknowledge anything that does not fit with your vision of how things should be." Eleanor's face had gone white. You are an ungrateful, disrespectful child. After everything I have done for you, everything you have done for me." Catherine's voice rose. "You have done nothing for me except try to control me, to mold me into something I am not, to sell me to the highest bidder like a piece of property." Thomas, who had been watching this exchange with a kind of stunned expression, suddenly slammed his hand on the table. "Enough, both of you, enough." But Eleanor was not finished. She leaned forward, her eyes fixed on Catherine, and she said something that would echo through the rest of the evening like a stone dropped into still water. "I know about Henry Garrett. I know what you did. I know what you are." The room seemed to stop. William, who had been eating mechanically, looked up. Margaret's fork paused halfway to her mouth. Catherine's face had gone the color of ash. "I don't know what you're talking about," Catherine whispered. "Don't lie to me," Eleanor said. "I am not a fool. I know you were with him. I know you became pregnant. I know that Ruth helped you." "Dispose of the problem." Thomas's head snapped toward Eleanor. "What are you talking about?" "Your precious daughter," Eleanor said, her voice dripping with contempt, "is not the innocent girl you thought she was. She has been with a man. She has been with child. She has—" "That's a lie," Catherine said, but her voice was barely audible. "Is it?" Eleanor turned to Ruth, who had been standing by the sideboard, frozen in shock. "Ruth, tell him. Tell him what you did. Tell him how you helped his daughter commit a sin that would damn her soul." Ruth did not speak. She stood perfectly still, her face a mask. "I will not have this conversation," Thomas said, his voice shaking with rage and alcohol. "I will not have my family's private matters discussed in this manner." "Your family's private matters?" Eleanor laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Your family's reputation is in tatters, Thomas. Your daughter is a whore, your son is a fool, and you are a failure. And I am trapped here with all of you, watching everything I have worked for crumble into dust." William stood up abruptly. "You will not speak about Catherine that way. Sit down," Thomas commanded. "I will not," William said. "Mother, you are being cruel and unjust. Catherine has done nothing to deserve—" "Nothing." Eleanor's voice was sharp as a blade. "She has brought shame upon this family. She has done what any young woman might do," William said. "She has fallen in love. And you, with your coldness and your cruelty, have made it impossible for her to confide in you, impossible for her to ask for help." Eleanor stood up, her chair scraping against the floor. "You are all against me, all of you. I have given everything to this family, and this is how you repay me. With ingratitude and disrespect and lies." "You have given nothing," Catherine said quietly. "You have only taken. You have taken our freedom, our privacy, our right to make our own choices. You have treated us as if we were possessions, things to be controlled and managed for your own benefit." Thomas stood up, his chair falling backward. "This conversation is over. Eleanor, you will go to your room. Catherine, you will—" He paused as if he had no idea what to say next. "You will also go to your room. William, Margaret, finish your dinner." But no one finished their dinner. Eleanor swept out of the room, her back rigid with anger. Catherine followed, her head held high but her hands shaking. William sat back down, his face flushed with emotion. Margaret, who had not spoken throughout the entire exchange, began to cry silently, tears running down her cheeks without a sound. Thomas stood at the head of the table, looking at the ruins of his meal, the cold food, the burned-down candles, and something inside him seemed to break. He sat down slowly, as if his legs would no longer support him. He put his head in his hands. "I'm sorry," he said, though it was unclear to whom he was apologizing. "I'm sorry, I'm sorry." William reached over and put his hand on his father's shoulder. "Father, it will be all right. We will find a way through this." But Thomas did not respond. He sat with his head in his hands, and his shoulders shook silently, and the candles burned down, and the food grew cold, and the evening stretched on into a darkness that seemed to have no end. What happened after that moment, is where the story becomes truly strange. Not because of anything supernatural, but because of the terrible logic of human desperation. After the confrontation at the dinner table, the family dispersed. Eleanor went to her room and locked the door. Catherine went to her room and did the same. William sat with his father for a time, trying to comfort him, but eventually he too withdrew. Margaret was sent to bed by Ruth, who tucked her in and told her that everything would be all right, a lie that both of them knew was a lie. Thomas remained in the dining room. He sat at the table, alone, and he drank. He drank the wine that was left in the glasses. He drank from the bottle that had been brought in for dinner. When that was finished, he sent for more, and Ruth, seeing the state he was in, brought it to him without comment. Around 9 o'clock, Eleanor came back downstairs. She had changed her clothes and composed herself, and she found Thomas still sitting at the table. She said something to him, no one knows exactly what, because there was no one there to hear it. But whatever she said, it was the final straw. Thomas stood up and he grabbed her arm and he said something in return, and Eleanor tried to pull away, and there was a moment of struggle that lasted only seconds. And then Eleanor fell. She fell backward, her head striking the edge of the sideboard. She fell hard, and she did not get up. Thomas stood there, staring at what he had done, and the full weight of his situation crashed down upon him. His wife was unconscious, possibly dead. His family was in ruins. His debts were unpayable. His reputation was destroyed. And he had just committed an act that, if discovered, would result in his execution. He called for William. His son came downstairs, and Thomas told him what had happened. William's face went white, but he did not panic. Instead, he did what his father asked him to do. He helped carry Eleanor to the cellar. They laid her on a cot that was kept there for storage, and they covered her with a blanket. Then Thomas went upstairs and called for Catherine. He told her that her mother had had an accident, that she was resting and that she would be fine. Catherine, still angry, still hurt, did not ask questions. She accepted what she was told. But Catherine was intelligent, and as the evening wore on, she began to piece together what had actually happened. She began to understand with a terrible clarity that her mother was not resting, that she was not going to be fine, that something far worse had occurred. She went to William's room and confronted him. William, exhausted and traumatized, told her the truth. Catherine's reaction was one of shock and horror, but also perhaps a kind of grim understanding. Her mother had pushed everyone to the breaking point. Her mother had been cruel and controlling and impossible to live with, and now her mother was gone, and there was nothing that could be done about it. The three of them, Thomas, William, and Catherine, sat together in the darkness and tried to figure out what to do. They could not call for a doctor. They could not tell anyone what had happened. If they did, Thomas would hang. The family would be destroyed. Everything would be lost. Thomas, in his desperation and his drunkenness, began to formulate a plan. It was a plan born of panic and alcohol and the kind of magical thinking that comes when a person is confronted with an impossible situation. He would leave. He would take William and Catherine and they would disappear. They would go west, to the frontier, where no one knew them, where they could start over. They would leave the plantation, leave the debts, leave the body of Eleanor in the cellar, and they would begin again. But there was a problem. Margaret. Margaret was 14 years old, and she could not be left behind. If she was left behind, she would eventually tell someone what had happened. She would be questioned and she would break, and the truth would come out. So Margaret would have to come with them. And there was another problem. Ruth. Ruth knew too much. Ruth had been in the house when Eleanor fell. Ruth had helped carry Eleanor to the cellar. Ruth knew that Eleanor was dead. Ruth could not be left behind either, because she too would eventually tell someone what had happened. So Thomas made a decision that would haunt the region for generations. He decided that Ruth would have to disappear as well. He called Ruth to his study. He told her that the family was leaving, that they were going west, and that she would come with them. Ruth, who had served the family for 23 years, who had helped raise the children, who had kept their secrets, understood immediately what was happening. She understood that Eleanor was dead. She understood that the family was fleeing. And she understood that she was being given a choice: come with them or be left behind to face the consequences. Ruth agreed to come. What choice did she have? Samuel, the cook, was not told. Samuel was not part of the family's inner circle. Samuel was a servant, and servants were not trusted with such secrets. But Samuel was intelligent, and he began to suspect that something was wrong. He noticed that Eleanor had not come to the kitchen to give her daily instructions. He noticed that the family seemed agitated, that they were moving about the house in the darkness, that they were gathering things together. Around midnight, Samuel went to the dining room to clear the table, as was his habit. He found it exactly as it had been left: the food still there, the candles burned down, the chairs empty. He knew immediately that something terrible had happened. He did not know what to do. He was enslaved, and the people he would normally report to, the white people of the household, were the ones involved in whatever had occurred. He could not go to the authorities because he was not sure what he had witnessed, and because he knew that his testimony would be worth very little. He was a black man in the South in 1847, and the word of a black man against the word of a white family would never stand in court. So Samuel did what he could do. He went to the quarters, and he told the other enslaved people what he had found. He told them that the family had disappeared, that something terrible had happened, and that they should prepare themselves for whatever came next. By dawn, the Mercer family was gone. Thomas, Eleanor, or rather Eleanor's body, William, Catherine, and Margaret had left the plantation in the darkness. They had taken horses, supplies, and what money Thomas could gather. They had left behind a household in chaos, a plantation without a master, and a mystery that would never be fully solved. Ruth went with them. She went because she had no choice, because she had been complicit in what had happened, because she understood that her only chance of survival lay in staying with the family that had owned her for so long. Samuel remained behind. He remained, and he kept the secret, and he lived with the knowledge of what had happened, and he never told anyone the truth. Not in his lifetime, not until he was old and dying, and he finally confessed to a younger man what he had witnessed that night. The story of what happened to the Mercer family after they left the plantation is a story of desperation, of the terrible logic of people trying to outrun their own crimes, of the way that one act of violence can set off a chain reaction that destroys everything it touches. They traveled west, moving at night, avoiding main roads, staying in small towns where no one knew them. Thomas told people that they were moving to start a new life, that he had sold his plantation, that they were seeking opportunities in the frontier. Most people accepted this explanation without question. The frontier was full of people running from something: debts, scandals, failed marriages, broken dreams. No one asked too many questions. But Eleanor's body was a problem. Thomas had wrapped it carefully, had told the children that they were transporting goods, had hidden it in a covered wagon. But as the weeks passed, as the weather grew warmer, as the body began to decompose, the smell became impossible to ignore. Thomas had to dispose of it. He chose a remote location, a ravine in the mountains of Tennessee, and he left Eleanor there, buried under rocks, hidden from the world. The children never spoke of it. They had been traumatized by what they had witnessed, by their complicity in their mother's death, by the knowledge that they were living a lie. But they did not speak of it, because speaking of it would have meant acknowledging what had happened, and acknowledging what had happened would have meant facing the consequences. They made it to Arkansas, to a small town on the edge of the frontier. Thomas used a false name. He called himself Thomas Mercer still, because he was not creative enough to invent a new identity, and he purchased land. He told people that he was a planter from Georgia, that he had come west to escape the heat and the humidity, that he was looking for a fresh start. For a time it seemed as if they might actually succeed. The land was fertile. The crops grew. Thomas began to establish himself in the community. William, now 18, began to think about his future. Catherine, now 20, began to think about marriage again. though she was careful to choose a man who would not ask too many questions about her past. But Ruth was dying. The journey west had been hard on her. She was older, and the stress of what had happened, the knowledge of what she had done, the weight of the secret she carried, had taken a toll on her health. Within a year of arriving in Arkansas, she had fallen ill with a fever that would not break. She lay in a small cabin on the edge of Thomas's property, and she called for Thomas, and she told him that she was going to die, and that she could not die with the secret still inside her. Thomas sat with her in the darkness, and Ruth told him that she had written down everything that had happened. She had written it in a journal, in a careful hand, documenting the events of that night, the confrontation at the dinner table, Eleanor's fall, the decision to flee. She had hidden the journal, she told him, and if anything happened to her, if she died, the journal would be found, and the truth would come out. Thomas was horrified. He demanded to know where the journal was. Ruth refused to tell him. She said that the journal was insurance, that it was the only thing that would ensure that the truth was eventually known, that Eleanor's death would not be forgotten, that the family would not be able to simply erase what had happened and start over. Ruth died 3 days later. Thomas searched her cabin thoroughly, but he could not find the journal. He searched the property. He searched the town. He never found it. And so the secret remained. The family continued to live their lives in Arkansas, always looking over their shoulders, always afraid that someone would discover the truth, always waiting for the moment when the past would catch up with them. Thomas died in 1862 during the Civil War of pneumonia. William survived the war and became a successful farmer. Catherine married and had children, and she lived a long life. But she never spoke of her mother, never mentioned Georgia, never allowed anyone to ask questions about her past. Margaret grew up and married and had a family of her own. She lived to be 87 years old, and on her deathbed, she finally told her daughter what had happened that night. Her daughter, shocked and horrified, did not know what to do with the information. By that time, everyone involved was dead. There was no one to prosecute, no one to hold accountable. The truth had become a ghost, a story that was told in whispers, a mystery that could never be solved. The plantation in Georgia fell into ruin. The house, with its white columns and its wraparound porch, slowly collapsed. The dining room, where the family had vanished, was eventually swallowed by the forest. By the early 20th century, there was nothing left but a few scattered stones and the memory of what had been. But the story persisted. It was told and retold, embellished and exaggerated, until it became a legend. People said that the family had been taken by spirits, that they had been cursed, that they had been punished for some sin they had committed. The dinner table, according to some versions of the story, was still there, still set, still waiting for the family to return. The candles, according to others, still burned, still casting their light on empty chairs. The truth, as is often the case, was far more mundane and far more tragic. There was no curse, no supernatural intervention, no divine punishment. There was only a family destroyed by secrets, by the weight of unspoken resentments, by the terrible logic of desperation. There was only a woman who had been too controlling, a man who had been too weak, children who had been caught in the middle, and a servant who had been forced to choose between loyalty and survival. And there was a dinner table set with good china, with food that grew cold, with candles that burned down to stubs, left behind as evidence of a moment when everything changed, when a family ceased to exist as a unit and became instead a collection of individuals running from their own shadows. The mystery of the Mercer family was never officially solved. Sheriff Harrow eventually gave up his investigation and moved on to other cases. The reward was never claimed. The family's disappearance was eventually attributed to voluntary flight, though no one could explain why they would have left in such a manner, why they would have abandoned their home and their property, why they would have left a meal sitting on the table. Over the years, various theories emerged. Some people believed that the family had been kidnapped by abolitionists and taken north. Others believed that they had been killed by enslaved people seeking revenge. Still others believed that they had simply decided to start over, to leave their old life behind and begin anew in the West. A few people, mostly those who had known Ruth or who had heard stories from her family, believed that something darker had occurred, something that involved violence and secrets and a desperate flight in the darkness. But the truth, the real truth, the one that Ruth had written down in her journal, the one that Margaret had finally revealed on her deathbed, remained hidden for more than a century. It was only in the 1960s, when a historian was researching the history of the region, that he came across a reference to a journal that had supposedly been hidden on the Mercer plantation. He searched for it, following old maps and old stories, and he eventually found it, buried in a sealed box beneath the ruins of what had once been Ruth's cabin. The journal was water-damaged and difficult to read in places, but the essential facts were clear. Eleanor had died in a fall. Thomas had panicked. The family had fled. Ruth had been taken with them, and the truth had been hidden away, preserved in ink and paper, waiting for the day when someone would finally read it and understand what had really happened. The historian published his findings in an academic journal, but the story never gained much traction. It was too late. Everyone involved was dead. There was no one to prosecute, no one to hold accountable. The mystery had been solved, but the solution was so mundane, so human, so utterly lacking in the supernatural drama that people had expected, that many people refused to believe it. They preferred the stories about curses and spirits and divine punishment. They preferred the mystery to the truth. And perhaps that is the real lesson of the Mercer family's disappearance. We are drawn to mysteries not because we want to know the truth, but because we want to believe that there is something more to life than the ordinary human dramas of ambition, resentment, desperation, and fear. We want to believe that there are forces at work in the world that are beyond our understanding, that there are explanations for the inexplicable that transcend the mundane reality of human weakness and human failure. But the truth is often far more terrible than any mystery. The truth is that a family can be destroyed not by curses or spirits, but by the simple inability to communicate, by the weight of secrets, by the terrible choices that people make when they are desperate and afraid. The truth is that a woman can die not because she was wicked or cursed, but because she was controlling and cold, and because her husband was weak and drunk. The truth is that children can be traumatized not by supernatural forces, but by the knowledge that their parents are capable of terrible things. The Mercer plantation is gone now. The land has been reclaimed by the forest. The dining room, where the family vanished, exists only in memory and in the stories that people tell. But the mystery remains, not because it has never been solved, but because people continue to prefer the mystery to the truth. What do you think happened that night? Do you believe that the family simply fled? Or do you think there is more to the story than we have been told? Do you think that Eleanor's death was truly an accident? Or do you think that Thomas intended to harm her? Do you think that Ruth's journal told the whole truth? Or do you think that there are still secrets hidden, still mysteries waiting to be uncovered? Leave your comment below. Tell me what you think. Tell me where you're listening from. And if you enjoyed this story, if it gave you chills, if it made you think about the secrets that families keep and the terrible choices that people make when they are desperate and afraid, then subscribe to this channel. Hit that notification bell so you never miss a story. Share this video with someone who loves dark mysteries, because there are so many more stories like this, so many more mysteries waiting to be told, so many more secrets hidden in the past, waiting for someone to finally bring them into the light. See you in the next video.